Hi guys, today we will start with the story why being a courtesan in ancient Rome was a terrible career. The unvarnished fate of a Roman courtesan, a dreary account of public decadence. In the heart of the ancient city of Rome, beneath the towering shadows of the Capitoline Hill, where marble structures gleamed under the Mediterranean sun, a young woman was born into obscurity. Her name, though recorded in no surviving inscription or household ledger, bore the soft consonants typical of the lower plebeian class. Her family occupied a crumbling tenement structure several floors above street level, where light was scarce and the air thick with smoke from countless braziers. Her father, a freedman engaged in minor leatherwork, rarely spoke. Her mother, prematurely aged and perpetually stooped, sold diluted wine to porters in the Sabura district. This setting, grim yet entirely unremarkable, set the stage for a trajectory neither tragic nor heroic, but merely tedious in its inevitability. From an early age, the girl was taught the silent labors of the lower classes, mending garments, fetching water, and enduring the harsh commands of her elders. She was not afforded education in letters or numbers, only in silence and survival. Her first exposure to the trade that would define her life came not through instruction but through observation. Aging women on corners, powdered with chalk and weary in the joints, exchanging their dignity for denarii. These women were neither admired nor pitied. They simply were fixtures of a system as mundane as it was brutal. Her transition into their world occurred gradually, almost imperceptibly, as if she had always been drifting in that direction from the moment of her birth. By her 12th year, her appearance had begun to garner notice. Not admiration nor romantic longing, but notice, as livestock is noted by a butcher, or timber by a builder. She did not understand the implications at first. There was no ceremony to mark her initiation, only a slow erosion of autonomy, a procession of increasingly suggestive tasks, and eventually, instructions from an older woman who claimed experience. This woman, nameless in the records of time, played the dual role of mentor and trafficker. She introduced the girl to the concept of the meretrix, a legally registered courtesan, beholden to taxation and regulation, but afforded no real protection under Roman law. Thus began a life of scheduled availability and economic exploitation, devoid of sentiment or variance. Labors without illusion. The courtesan's first routine. Early morning differed little from night, gray, sluggish, saturated with stale air, and the sounds of a city stirring awake. The girl did not wake by choice, but in response to certain cues. The creak of wooden stairs, the footsteps from below, or the dull knock upon a pane of glass. The room in which she lived bore no comfort or personality. It held a low cot with a straw mattress, coarse cloth nailed over the windows in lieu of curtains, and a clay vessel for water. The walls were cracked, the floor uneven, and the ceiling perpetually damp. Moisture seeped through every surface, as did the stench of bodies, sweat, and wine, which had long since saturated the air. Each morning began with a wash in freezing water and the donning of garments devoid of elegance, but suited to function. These included a tunic made of coarse linen and sandals with frayed straps. Her hair was tied into a simple knot, and her face left unadorned. Beauty in her profession was considered a vulnerability. She then descended to the street, where the day awaited. Not unique, not noteworthy, but compulsory. She did not choose clients, nor impose terms. Each encounter was a matter of survival, never of pleasure. Her existence was an uninterrupted sequence of services, not all of which were compensated, and not always with coin. The particular hardships of a courtesan's labor in Rome extended beyond physical exhaustion to encompass constant fear, inspections by tax officials, street violence, disease. Registration was mandatory. The state required every meretrix to appear on official rolls, to pay dues, and to refrain from asserting any claim to respectable womanhood. The cruel irony was that legality increased her exposure. As a registered worker, she could expect no protection as a free woman, nor could she vanish like a slave. She was visible, defined, and entirely unshielded. No one concerned themselves with her fatigue. No one inquired how many men she had already seen that day, or whether she had slept the previous night. No one cared for her name, her story, or her preferences. In her world, there was no private self, only function, only need, only repetition. The only consistent element was routine, and it remained unchanged no matter how long the day stretched. Life under surveillance, bureaucracy, and social control. Upon becoming a meretrix, the girl immediately entered a state apparatus, whose bureaucratic machinery allowed no respite. Her registration in tax ledgers occurred under the strict gaze of local officials who regularly arrived to verify records. Each woman was required to undergo mandatory medical inspections, often conducted without due delicacy. These inspections were not mere formalities, but mechanisms of control designed to detect signs of illness that could threaten the health of clients, predominantly from the patrician and equestrian classes. Reports on her health status were entered into official registers, and even the slightest discrepancy could lead to fines, arrest, or exile. On top of this, the taxes she was compelled to pay constituted a significant portion of her earnings. These funds did not improve her living conditions, but rather sustained the impersonal machinery itself. To bureaucrats, she was not a person but a revenue asset, whose existence required strict accounting to avoid loss of profit or potential unrest. Such governmental intervention robbed courtesans of any real choice. Their freedom was illusory, masked by registration and a veneer of legality. They had no right to complain about mistreatment by clients. For being under official surveillance, they risked losing not only income, but the very ability to continue working. This constant oversight created an atmosphere of fear and submission, where even minor acts of defiance could result in severe punishment. Furthermore, the social position of a courtesan was precarious. Despite their apparent openness and public presence, they remained marginalized, rejected and yet simultaneously in demand. Neighbors regarded them with disdain, officials with suspicion. Their lives were transparent and visible, but their rights were ephemeral and easily violated. This paradox defined their existence: to be needed, but to belong to no one. Physical trials. The body as both tool and burden. The work of a courtesan in Rome demanded constant physical exertion, allowing no rest or reprieve. The daily efforts were so exhausting that even a young and healthy girl soon lost her former suppleness and freshness. Long hours spent with clients, often many and sometimes rough, wore down not only muscles, but also the nervous system. Painful and traumatic situations became routine, accepted as an unavoidable part of the profession. Reality was far removed from romantic notions of beauty and charm. A courtesan's body ceased to be merely attractive. It became a tool, burdened with heavy obligations and strict standards. Constant use without adequate recovery led to chronic illnesses, wounds, and deformities. Among the most frequent afflictions were sexually transmitted infections, rarely fully treated and often turning chronic. Despite this, society expected courtesans not only to be physically available, but also to create the illusion of pleasure and enjoyment. This contrast between inner state and outward appearance required extraordinary endurance and concealment. Any sign of weakness or pain was seen as falling from grace and became grounds for condemnation or expulsion from the profession. Thus, the courtesan's body was both instrument and shackle, binding her to the endless cycle of work. Psychological fatigue, a life without rest or hope. In addition to physical trials, the courtesan faced profound inner exhaustion. Constant stress from performing roles that did not align with her true self led to feelings of alienation and emptiness. Each new client became another act in a play requiring artificial displays of emotion, which the girl often no longer had the strength to summon. The monotony and hopelessness of life bred depression, yet expressing it was dangerous. It could lead to decreased demand and, consequently, income. Her psyche was under constant pressure. She had to maintain smiles and friendliness, hide pain and fatigue, and suppress anger or sorrow. Any sign of weakness was perceived as a threat to her employment and ultimately to her survival. The social environment around the courtesan was as ruthless as her clients. She could not afford trust or openness, as betrayal and mockery lurked around every corner. Hope for a better life was practically non-existent. Over the years, girls who lost their former allure slipped into the category of old courtesans. Forgotten, feeble, and unwanted, they became ghosts of the streets, surviving on charity and memories of past glory. This scenario was grimly realistic, leaving no room for dreams, as society rejected even attempts to break free from established bounds. Social stigma, exile from society. The life of a courtesan was overshadowed by constant social condemnation and stigma. Although her services were in demand and often respected among certain social circles, to the majority she remained an outcast, an outsider in her own city. Her presence on the streets was frequently met with scornful looks and mockery, and conversations about her were whispered and rife with gossip. Even women from lower social strata distanced themselves, fearing association with the dirty profession. Courtesans rarely had the chance to form families or bear children, as their lifestyle and social status were deemed unacceptable for proper upbringing. Laws and traditions restricted their rights, denying them the opportunity to integrate into society. This social alienation deepened feelings of loneliness and inner isolation, breeding profound emotional pain and hopelessness. Occasionally, attempts arose among courtesans to organize support or communities, but these seldom succeeded and quickly dissolved under pressure from authorities and public opinion. In the end, they remained isolated and vulnerable, lacking protection and support, perpetually teetering on the brink of survival. Financial trap, money and debts. Although courtesans received payment for their services, their financial situation was often critical. A large portion of their earnings went to taxes, fines, and bribes that had to be regularly paid to officials and guards to avoid trouble and arrest. Additionally, many courtesans fell into debt due to high expenses for maintaining appearance and purchasing necessities for work, cosmetics, clothing, jewelry. Often, they were forced to borrow money from wealthy clients or moneylenders, which deepened their dependence and reduced their actual income. Debts became chains that kept them trapped, preventing them from leaving the profession and starting a new life. Even when they managed to earn a substantial sum temporarily, expenses quickly consumed the profit, leaving only scraps. As a result, many courtesans remained under constant financial pressure, living from paycheck to paycheck without the possibility to accumulate capital to change their fate. This created a vicious cycle where they were both prey and prisoners of their own circumstances. The danger of disease. Inevitable suffering. The health of courtesans was constantly at risk. In ancient Rome, medical knowledge was limited and hygiene was poor. Constant contact with different people, often under unfavorable conditions, led to frequent illnesses, especially sexually transmitted infections. Treatment was expensive and not always accessible, and many diseases became chronic. Moreover, due to a lack of proper care and rest, even common colds and injuries could develop into serious complications. Courtesans often suffered from exhaustion, anemia, and other issues caused by continuous stress and poor nutrition. Many women did not live to old age, and those who survived became weak and dependent on charity. Diseases not only destroyed health, but also led to loss of clients and income. A courtesan showing visible signs of illness quickly became undesirable, and a lack of treatment worsened her situation, plunging her further into poverty and loneliness. Restrictions on freedom, constant subjugation. Courtesans in ancient Rome were not free women in the full sense. Their freedom was heavily constrained by social norms, laws, and control by the state and patrons. Most lived under constant surveillance, whether by the owner of the house where they lived or an influential patron who controlled their actions and connections. Crossing the limits meant facing harsh punishments, including corporal punishment or exile. Courtesans had no right to manage their own income or choose clients at their discretion. Their personal lives and freedom were sacrificed to professional duties and control. This constant subjugation bred feelings of helplessness and dependence, intensifying psychological burdens and stripping away hope for an independent future. Courtesans remained prisoners of their position, unable to change their fate without external help. Strict beauty standards, constant pressure. For courtesans in ancient Rome, appearance was not merely a matter of aesthetics, but of survival. Society and clients demanded strict standards of beauty, youth, and grooming. Girls were forced to constantly maintain themselves, spending significant time and money on cosmetics, hairstyling, aromatherapy, and jewelry. Beauty standards were complex and sometimes cruel. Aging or even the slightest signs of fatigue could lead to loss of clients and income. Courtesans feared not only natural bodily changes, but also criticism from others, which could destroy their reputation. This constant pressure caused not only physical exhaustion, but also deep stress. Many girls resorted to dangerous methods to preserve youth and beauty, which only worsened their health and shortened their career span. Ultimately, beauty became both their greatest asset and a heavy burden. Lack of protection, vulnerability to violence. Courtesans in ancient Rome were often victims of both physical and psychological violence. Their social position and professional status made them vulnerable to the arbitrariness of clients, guards, and even authorities. They had practically no legal protection and could not expect fair consideration of their complaints. Violence was a common part of their lives, and many girls were forced to endure cruel treatment to maintain their ability to work and earn. The threat of punishment or exile compelled courtesans to remain silent and hide instances of violence, fearing the loss of their only source of income. This constant threat shattered their psyche, leading to fear, anxiety, and depression. The absence of support and the inability to defend themselves made the courtesan's life especially harsh and dangerous. Society and double standards, an unbearable burden. Courtesans in ancient Rome lived under double standards, on one hand condemned and despised, on the other exploited and even revered. Society demanded they entertain and satisfy male desires, but did not recognize them as human beings deserving respect and protection. This contradictory position made the courtesan's life especially painful. They constantly faced humiliation and disregard, even when performing their work perfectly. Any mistake or sign of weakness became grounds for judgment and mockery, yet they remained indispensable figures in Roman culture, their role both public and secret. These double standards deepened feelings of loneliness and isolation. Courtesans could not rely on support from men or women, leaving them vulnerable and trapped. Limited choice, lack of alternatives. For many girls, becoming a courtesan was less a choice and more a forced necessity. The social and economic position of women in ancient Rome was severely limited, and alternatives for earning a living were often non-existent. Without education, property rights, or family support, many faced a harsh choice: poverty or service as a courtesan. Many entered the profession due to poverty, loss of relatives, or unfortunate circumstances. Opportunities to improve social status were virtually non-existent, and courtesanship was one of the few professions where a woman could at least provide for herself and survive. This limited choice made life hopeless. They knew that changing their fate would be incredibly difficult, and attempts to leave the profession could end in ruin and even greater humiliation. Life without rights. Complete lack of legal protection. In ancient Rome, courtesans existed beyond the law, in a legal vacuum where their rights were severely limited or non-existent. They had no ability to protect themselves in court, file lawsuits, or seek justice in cases of violence, theft, or deceit. The laws did not consider them full citizens, but rather treated them as property or objects of exploitation. This meant courtesans were entirely dependent on the goodwill of patrons, household owners, or authorities who could strip them of freedom, property, or even life without consequences. Even a client's displeasure could result in harsh punishment, and there was no guarantee that the courtesan would receive any support. Such a status destroyed any hope for justice and protection, leaving every courtesan vulnerable and forced to constantly seek shelter under the influence of powerful people. The absence of rights created an atmosphere of constant fear and uncertainty, where any attempts to fight for dignity and freedom often ended in defeat. Psychological trauma. Invisible wounds. The life of a courtesan in ancient Rome left deep psychological scars that were often far more devastating than physical suffering. Constant neglect, humiliation, and condemnation bred feelings of inferiority and inner emptiness in these women. They had to hide their true emotions and often pretend to be strong in front of clients and society while feeling pain and loneliness inside. Many courtesans suffered from chronic stress, anxiety, and depression. They often felt cut off from normal life, deprived of the right to love and respect. Social isolation, the inability to build long-term relationships, and the constant struggle for survival became sources of relentless, emotional exhaustion. The lack of support and understanding worsened the psychological trauma. Courtesans could not openly speak about their feelings, fearing judgment and further alienation. Many lived in an internal conflict between the necessity to perform their work and the desire for a better life, making their existence even more tragic. These psychological wounds did not heal quickly. They accompanied the women for many years, leaving marks on their behavior and the worldview. Many courtesans never overcame this trauma, often leading to alcoholism, self-destruction, and even suicide. Social isolation. Life on the margins of society. Courtesans in ancient Rome existed on the very edge of the social spectrum, living and working under conditions that excluded them from most social and family ties. Despite some popularity and attention from influential men, these women were essentially isolated from normal life and full participation in social activities. Their existence often unfolded in the shadows, within private homes or public venues, where they served as entertainment and objects of desire, but not as equal members of society. Society simultaneously desired their presence and rejected them, preventing the formation of strong friendships or family relationships. Many courtesans lived in loneliness, deprived of support and understanding from relatives or friends. This led to chronic feelings of isolation and alienation, which increased their psychological vulnerability. The lack of a social network not only worsened their emotional state, but also limited their opportunities to leave the profession and seek a new life. Social isolation created a vicious cycle. Lack of support led to vulnerability and dependence made it impossible to build an independent future. Courtesans seemed to live on the border between two worlds, visible and invisible, desired and rejected simultaneously. Economic dependence. Life under control. Courtesans in ancient Rome had almost no economic freedom. Their earnings were typically controlled by household owners or patrons who often appropriated a significant portion of the money earned. This turned courtesans into economically dependent people who, despite the appearance of client choice, were effectively prisoners of the financial system. Most women had no access to their own savings or the right to manage the money they earned. Even if a courtesan made a lot, a large part of it went toward paying debts, patrons, protection, or living expenses. Such economic exploitation made it difficult to accumulate capital, invest in education, or transition to another profession. Women remained trapped where money was both a survival tool and a source of new dependence. The inability to manage their finances limited their freedom and cemented their role as dependents on men who controlled not only their bodies, but their entire lives. Economic dependence intensified feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. It undermined the desire to seek an escape from the situation and increased vulnerability to manipulation and abuse by those around them. Lack of education and skills, the trap of the profession. For most courtesans in ancient Rome, lack of education was a key reason why they could not choose another life path. Education for women at that time was either inaccessible or strictly limited, and courtesans, immersed in their profession, had no opportunity to develop or learn. Without skills and knowledge to help them pursue other professions, they remained tied to their position, unable to build careers outside the realm of entertainment and pleasure. Their minds and talents often went unappreciated, and potential remained unrealized. Lack of education deprived courtesans of prospects for social mobility and economic independence. It increased their vulnerability and dependence on patrons who controlled not only their earnings, but also their life choices. Moreover, many courtesans experienced internal conflict. Awareness of their limitations and knowledge caused feelings of shame and despair. This psychologically cemented them in the profession, cutting off paths to growth and change. Thus, lack of education turned courtesans into prisoners of circumstances, deprived of the opportunity to step beyond a defined social role and gain independence. Dependence on patrons, the illusion of protection. In the courtesan system of ancient Rome, patrons played a dual role. On one hand, they provided financial support, protection, and access to a luxurious life that seemed unattainable for most women. On the other hand, this dependence was illusory and often turned into a new form of slavery. Patrons controlled not only the courtesan's income, but also their behavior, social connections, and even personal relationships. Women had to adapt to the desires and whims of influential men, sometimes sacrificing their own comfort and safety. Patrons could demand complete obedience, and refusal or attempts at independence were seen as betrayal. Despite apparent support, patronage often limited courtesans' freedom and kept them in constant fear of losing their protector and being left defenseless. This dependence increased social and psychological pressure, locking women into vulnerable positions. The illusion of protection often ended in tragedy. Patrons could suddenly withdraw support, leaving a courtesan without means of subsistence, or even betray her, leading to complete loss of status and opportunities. Thus, dependence on patrons was not only economic, but deeply psychological, creating a complex web of power and submission from which it was extremely difficult to escape. Physical dangers and health, a constant threat to life. The life of a courtesan in ancient Rome was fraught with continuous physical risks that could not only deteriorate health, but also lead to death. The lack of modern medical knowledge and sanitary conditions made their work extremely hazardous. Many courtesans suffered from infections, sexually transmitted diseases, and chronic illnesses that went untreated. Colds, inflammations, and injuries often caused serious complications. Medical care was either unavailable or severely limited, especially for women from lower social classes. Moreover, physical violence from clients or patrons was commonplace. Courtesans could be subjected to beatings, coerced into dangerous sexual practices, or cruel treatment. This inflicted not only physical pain, but also deepened psychological trauma, creating a cycle of violence and fear. The constant threats to life and health turned the courtesan's work into an endless struggle for survival, where any sign of weakness could cost them their life or freedom. Under such conditions, a long or peaceful life was impossible, and fear and pain became inseparable parts of daily existence. Stigmatization and social contempt, the burden of shame. Courtesans in ancient Rome faced harsh social condemnation and stigmatization that followed them at every turn. Society viewed them as immoral, depraved, and dangerous women, branding them with a mark of shame that made them outcasts. Even if a courtesan possessed beauty, intelligence, or talents, it did not free her from prejudiced attitudes and discrimination. Social contempt was expressed not only in words, but also in restrictions on social rights. Courtesans were forbidden from marrying, holding civil rights, or participating in public life. They remained on the margins, cut off from normal interactions with the rest of society. This condemnation led to internal conflict and feelings of inadequacy. Women often felt isolated and rejected, deprived of the opportunity to build full relationships and realize themselves as individuals. Social stigma created additional pressure, intensifying feelings of loneliness and hopelessness. This burden of shame accompanied courtesans, even after their careers ended, leaving a deep mark on their lives and self-esteem. Vulnerability to violence, a constant threat to safety. Courtesans in ancient Rome often became victims of violence, both physical and sexual. Their position in society, lack of protection, and absence of rights made them easy prey for brutal treatment by clients, patrons, and even other men. Frequent cases of beatings, violence, and exploitation were common, turning their lives into an ongoing struggle for safety. Many courtesans had no opportunity to refuse clients or avoid dangerous situations due to economic dependence and fear of losing their protector. This forced them to endure violence, hide their suffering, and remain in constant tension. The absence of legal protection and equality worsened the situation. The laws and social norms of the time did not protect courtesans and sometimes even justified violence against them. This created an atmosphere of impunity for perpetrators and fear for the victims. The psychological consequences of violence were devastating. Constant fear, trauma, and feelings of helplessness accompanied courtesans for many years. For many women, this became the background of their entire lives, where danger and threat were inseparable. Lack of legal protection, vulnerability. Before the law, courtesans in ancient Rome were in an extremely vulnerable legal position. They had no civil rights and often could not rely on protection from state institutions. The legal system, dominated by patriarchal norms, regarded them more as property or objects than as full citizens. Legally, courtesans were deprived of the right to marry, own property, or file lawsuits. This meant that in conflicts, whether financial disputes, acts of violence, or deception by patrons or clients, they had no real means of protection or justice. The law also did not protect them from exploitation and violence. Crimes against courtesans were often ignored or minimized, and punishments for perpetrators were rare and lenient. This contributed to their complete defenselessness against abuse. The lack of legal protection intensified their social and psychological pressure, deprived them of hope for justice, and deepened their sense of vulnerability. Courtesans remained prisoners of a system where power and law were in the hands of men and did not consider the interests or safety of women. Psychological pressure and emotional exhaustion. The life of a courtesan in ancient Rome was accompanied not only by physical, but also by enormous psychological burdens. Constant stress from the need to satisfy the desires of numerous clients, fear of violence, and social condemnation created unbearable emotional tension. Many courtesans suffered from feelings of loneliness and isolation, despite being surrounded by people and apparent social activity. The lack of support and opportunity for genuine relationships intensified inner conflict and psychological instability. Constant pretense and the need to hide their true feelings caused emotional exhaustion. Courtesans had to suppress fear, anger, sadness, and fatigue to conform to the image expected of them. Prolonged exposure to such conditions led to depression, anxiety disorders, and other mental health issues. In the absence of professional help and understanding, many women faced their inner demons alone. Thus, psychological pressure and emotional exhaustion became an invisible but destructive part of a courtesan's life, affecting all areas of her existence and reducing her quality of life. Social isolation and the inability to form genuine relationships. Courtesans in ancient Rome often found themselves in deep social isolation. Despite constantly being surrounded by people, clients, patrons, rivals, they rarely had truly close, sincere relationships. Social norms and stigmas surrounding their profession prevented them from creating trusting bonds. The constant fear of rejection by society or betrayal by those who seemed close forced courtesans to keep their distance. They understood that any attempts to form deep personal relationships could end in betrayal or ridicule. Furthermore, society held the belief that courtesans were incapable of love and true loyalty, which further intensified their loneliness. Partners often saw them merely as entertainment, not as equals in a relationship. The lack of genuine emotional support led to feelings of inner emptiness and alienation. Courtesans remained lonely even in crowds, and the inability to form normal relationships worsened their psychological state. Thus, social isolation became another severe trial, undermining both the emotional and physical health of women and making them feel deprived of the right to happiness. Economic instability and unpredictable income. Although courtesans could earn significant sums of money for their services, their economic situation remained extremely unstable and unpredictable. The lack of steady income and guaranteed support made them hostages to circumstances, where any change could lead to financial collapse. Courtesans' earnings depended on the moods and whims of clients, as well as their ability to retain patrons. Periods of abundance were often replaced by times of poverty and need. If a patron died, lost interest, or turned to another woman, the courtesan found herself without means of subsistence. Moreover, expenses for upkeep, clothing, jewelry, cosmetics, were high. Since appearance played a key role in their profession, maintaining their image required constant spending that often consumed a significant part of their earnings. The absence of savings and financial safety nets made courtesans vulnerable to any unexpected events, illness, loss of clients, or social changes. This increased anxiety and stress, creating a feeling of constant struggle for survival. Thus, economic instability was an inseparable part of a courtesan's life, turning her existence into a never-ending fight for financial independence, which she practically never had. Dangers of reputation and social influence. The reputation of a courtesan in ancient Rome was fragile and easily destroyed. In a society where honor and social status were paramount, even the slightest rumor or unproven accusation could lead to catastrophic consequences. Courtesans constantly lived under the threat of losing their reputation, which could mean not only losing clients, but also social isolation and danger to life. It was rumored that courtesans could use connections with influential men to gain some protection or privileges. However, this connection was highly unreliable and depended on the whims of patrons. Losing a patron could instantly lead to a fall in social status and loss of support. Moreover, courtesans were often targets of envy and slander from rivals and enemies. The spread of rumors could quickly destroy a woman's reputation, which in a harsh social system meant losing the ability to earn and survive. As a result, courtesans had to carefully monitor their behavior, choose their social circles wisely, and constantly fight to maintain their social standing. This constant stress and tension seriously affected their psychological state and quality of life. The constant need to maintain a persona, a mask, hiding the true life. One of the most difficult and exhausting aspects of a courtesan's life was the constant need to maintain a carefully crafted persona that attracted clients and secured patrons. It was a kind of performance where every detail, from clothing and makeup to manners and speech, had to create the illusion of perfection and availability. However, behind this external mask lay a very different, often painful reality. Courtesans had to suppress their true feelings and desires, hide fatigue, fears, and disappointments to meet the expectations of society and clients. This constant duality led to deep inner conflict and a feeling of alienation from themselves. The courtesan's image was often built on stereotypes and myths imposed by society. A playful, confident, frivolous woman ready to satisfy any whim. But behind this facade was a vulnerable person, often suffering from loneliness, pain, and a lack of genuine connections. Maintaining this mask required enormous emotional and physical resources. Courtesans spent a great deal of time and effort preparing for meetings, constantly perfecting their appearance and behavior. This exhausted them and deprived them of the chance to be themselves, creating a vicious cycle of alienation. Thus, the need to constantly play a role without letting their true emotions out became one of the main sources of suffering and internal crisis in a courtesan's life. Loss of freedom of choice, coercion, and dependence. The life of a courtesan in ancient Rome was often closely tied to a restriction of personal freedom and an inability to make decisions independently. Despite the outward illusion of independence and material well-being, many women found themselves in a position close to coercion. Economic dependence on patrons and clients deprived courtesans of the opportunity to refuse unwanted services or change their profession. The threat of losing financial support and being left without means of subsistence forced them to endure circumstances that limited their freedom of choice and control over their own lives. Moreover, courtesans were often subjected to pressure from social and family norms that condemned their lifestyle and questioned their moral qualities. This created additional psychological pressure and feelings of guilt, exacerbating their dependence and hopelessness. Thus, despite the apparent external appeal and material benefits, courtesans were deprived of true freedom. Their lives were controlled by circumstances, fears, and needs that made them vulnerable and submissive. Physical and emotional consequences, health and vulnerability. The life of a courtesan in ancient Rome was associated with constant threats to health and physical well-being. Frequent contact with various men without modern protective measures led to a high risk of contracting diseases, including venereal infections, which often became chronic and fatal. The lack of access to effective medical care worsened the situation. Courtesans, even with symptoms of serious illnesses, rarely received qualified treatment. This not only deteriorated their health, but also shortened their lifespan. Physical suffering was often accompanied by deep emotional trauma. Constant feelings of threat, the need to hide pain and maintain an attractive appearance led to chronic fatigue, depression, and anxiety disorders. Moreover, harsh treatment and violence from clients and patrons were common realities. Many courtesans faced coercion, beatings, and even torture, leaving deep psychological scars. Thus, the life of a courtesan was full of risks to physical and emotional health, making their condition extremely vulnerable and often doomed to suffering. Psychological pressure and shame. inner conflicts and self-identification. The life of a courtesan in ancient Rome was accompanied not only by external hardships, but also by deep inner conflicts related to self-perception and society's views. Social condemnation and moral norms branded women with a stigma of shame, causing them to experience constant feelings of guilt and inner turmoil. Many courtesans endured painful contradictions between the necessity to perform their work and the desire to be accepted by society as whole individuals. They realized that their activity brought income, but also subjected them to humiliation and alienation. The inner conflict was worsened by the inability to reveal their true selves and feelings. Courtesans had to suppress natural desires, dreams, and aspirations, masking their vulnerability and fear behind a facade of confidence and ease. Feelings of guilt and shame often led to psychological disorders, lowering self-esteem and deteriorating quality of life. In the absence of support and understanding, women remained alone with their suffering, intensifying their pain. Thus, psychological pressure and shame became an invisible yet powerful force, destroying the inner world of the courtesan and depriving her of the opportunity for self-realization. Lack of legal protection and rights, vulnerability before the law. Courtesans in ancient Rome had virtually no legal protection or recognized rights. Their social position was unofficial and often incomplete from the perspective of legal status. This meant that in cases of violence, deception, or unfair treatment, they could not count on protection by law or fair retribution. The legal norms of the time usually protected the interests of men, owners, patrons, clients, leaving courtesans vulnerable. Any complaints about abuse or violence were often ignored or turned against the women themselves, exposing them to even greater risk. Furthermore, courtesans had no rights to formal marriage or inheritance, which further limited their opportunities for social mobility and security. Their position depended solely on the will and goodwill of their patrons, making them extremely vulnerable. The lack of legal support not only increased economic and social instability, but also undermined their sense of self-worth and confidence in the future. Courtesans lived in constant fear and uncertainty, making their lives even more difficult and helpless. Social alienation and isolation. Life outside society. Courtesans in ancient Rome lived on the periphery of social life, often excluded from the norms and traditions that governed the behavior of most women. Despite relative visibility and occasional material well-being, they remained isolated from full participation in social, family, and religious life. This alienation was caused by rigid prejudices and moral attitudes that branded the courtesan as an unclean and lost woman. Public condemnation and stereotypes deprived them of respect and human dignity, turning them into outcasts. Lack of support from family and society meant that courtesans could not rely on help in difficult times, be it illness, old age, or social upheaval. Their fate often depended solely on their own efforts and fears. Isolation intensified feelings of loneliness and hopelessness, making the courtesan's life emotionally heavy and devoid of hope for a better future. They existed in a vicious circle where the only source of support was temporary relationships with clients, which were mostly superficial and unstable. Thus, social alienation and isolation became inseparable parts of a courtesan's life, undermining her chances for a full and dignified existence. Economic instability and dependence. Financial traps. Although the profession of a courtesan is sometimes associated with material wealth and luxury, the reality for most women was much harsher and more complicated. Economic instability and constant dependence on clients and patrons became one of the main problems in their lives. Courtesans' incomes were irregular and often unpredictable. Patrons could suddenly withdraw support, and the client base changed rapidly, leading to periods of poverty and hunger. Many women had no savings or property, as most of their earnings went toward maintaining their appearance, paying for housing, and debts. Moreover, many courtesans fell into debt traps, borrowing money at high interest rates to maintain their status and appearance. Such financial dependence only increased their vulnerability and limited opportunities to leave the profession. The constant pressure to earn and uphold their image sometimes forced women to make dangerous or humiliating concessions, worsening their economic and personal instability. Thus, despite apparent luxury and glamour, a courtesan's life was fraught with financial difficulties and dependence, making it extremely fragile and unpredictable. Risk of violence and crime. Dangers of everyday life. The life of a courtesan in ancient Rome was full of constant risks related to violence and crime. In a situation where women lacked legal protection and social support, they became easy targets for various forms of abuse. Courtesans often faced violence from clients, patrons, and even passers-by. Coercion into non-consensual sexual acts, beatings, threats to life. This was the harsh reality they confronted daily. These situations were worsened by the inability to go to court or receive help from authorities. Additionally, courtesans could become victims of robbery, extortion, and kidnapping, as their social position and profession made them vulnerable in dangerous parts of the city. Many were forced to live a secretive life, constantly fearing attacks and persecution. Constant exposure to an atmosphere of fear and threats affected the courtesan's psyche, causing anxiety, stress, and paranoia. For many women, such a life was a test of endurance and survival skills, often leading to psychological trauma and physical injuries. Thus, the dangers of violence and crime were inseparable parts of a courtesan's everyday life, creating serious obstacles to maintaining health and safety. Harsh competition and social struggle, the fight for attention and survival. The profession of a courtesan in ancient Rome was accompanied by fierce competition among women vying for a limited number of wealthy clients and patrons. This struggle extended beyond mere physical attraction or conversational skills. It involved complex social maneuvers, intrigue, and even deceit. Competition often led to the destruction of rivals' reputations, theft, spreading of rumors, and even direct violence. Women sought to emphasize their uniqueness through various methods, from expensive jewelry and clothing to displaying education and artistic talents. Moreover, the fight for clients meant constant psychological tension and stress, as losing a patron could significantly worsen one's financial situation. Courtesans had to maintain a high level of appearance, intellect, and charm, which required great effort and resources. In such conditions, many women lost their sense of self-worth and became hostages to an endless race for recognition and survival. Competition turned their lives into a constant struggle, devoid of peace and stability. Thus, harsh competition and social struggle were inseparable elements of a courtesan's life, shaping it as a complex, tense, and often destructive environment. Lack of prospects and life opportunities. A vicious circle of fate. For courtesans in ancient Rome, the prospect of changing their lives or leaving the profession was extremely limited. Lack of education, social stigma, and economic dependence created a vicious circle from which it was almost impossible to escape. Most courtesans came from lower social strata and had no opportunity to receive quality education or acquire skills that could help them in another profession. Society closed its doors to them, rejecting and condemning. Attempts to change their fate often ended in failure. Without legal and social support, women could not claim other employment or stable marriages that would provide security and respect. A courtesan's life became a constant struggle for survival, where each new day brought new challenges and threats. The lack of hope for change bred feelings of hopelessness and despair, undermining mental and physical health. Thus, a courtesan's fate was often predetermined from the start, depriving her of the opportunity to develop and build a full life beyond the profession to which circumstances forced her. Loss of personal identity and psychological trauma. The price of the profession. The life of a courtesan in ancient Rome was accompanied not only by physical dangers and social restrictions, but also by deep psychological trauma. Constant pressure from external circumstances, the need to conform to imposed images, and regular emotional abuse led to a serious loss of personal identity. For many women, the profession became not just a job, but a life ordeal during which they lost themselves, their dreams, desires, and their own self. Often, they had to suppress inner feelings and hide true emotions to survive in this harsh world. Psychological trauma manifested as chronic anxiety, depression, feelings of isolation, and loneliness. The inability to trust others exacerbated internal conflict and created deep alienation. Over time, this internal struggle could lead to severe mental disorders, loss of interest in life, and even suicidal thoughts. Meanwhile, society remained deaf to the suffering of courtesans, perceiving them only as instruments of pleasure and debauchery. Thus, the loss of personal identity and psychological trauma became an invisible but heavy price paid by many women trapped in this profession. Dependence on patrons and loss of freedom of choice. The life of a courtesan in ancient Rome was closely tied to her relationships with patrons, wealthy and influential men who provided financial support and social status. However, this dependence was a double-edged trap, depriving the woman of freedom of choice and making her vulnerable to the whims and caprices of her patron. Patrons could demand complete devotion, restrictions on contact with other men, and participation in dangerous or humiliating activities. Refusal or disagreement was often punished with financial penalties, social isolation, or even violence. In this sense, the courtesan became more of her patron's possession than a free individual. Moreover, the loss of autonomy affected every aspect of life, from living conditions to moral and emotional boundaries. Courtesans often could not decide independently whom and when to meet, leading to deep internal conflict and feelings of powerlessness. Such a level of dependence increased psychological stress and undermined health, making the courtesan's life even more vulnerable and unstable. Despite outward luxury, her inner world remained a prisoner of someone else's will and control. Thus, dependence on patrons was one of the main reasons for the loss of personal freedom and independence, turning a courtesan's life into a constant struggle to retain any control over her own fate. Constant feeling of isolation and loneliness. Inner struggle. Despite the apparent external glamour and numerous admirers, the life of a courtesan was deeply lonely and isolated. Social norms and public prejudices barred her from normal life, genuine human relationships, and true intimacy. Courtesans lived in constant fear of rejection and ridicule, which made them keep distance from other women and even men, except clients and patrons. This rejection deepened feelings of alienation and amplified inner emptiness. The persistent sense of being seen only as an object for pleasure, not as a person, left deep emotional scars. The inability to build real friendships or romantic relationships led to chronic loneliness. The inner struggle between the desire for love and the acceptance of their role as courtesans resulted in conflicts that often ended in emotional exhaustion and depression. In this vicious circle, many women lost hope for a better future. Thus, despite an external life filled with bright events and encounters, inner emptiness and loneliness became constant companions of the courtesan, destroying her soul and leaving incurable wounds. Economic vulnerability and dependence on external factors. The life of a courtesan in ancient Rome was extremely unstable economically. Most women who chose this path had no personal resources and were entirely dependent on clients and patrons. This economic vulnerability turned them into hostages of circumstances, where even the slightest worsening of the situation could could lead to catastrophic consequences. Losing a patron or a decrease in clients meant a sharp decline in income, often making it impossible to provide for even basic needs: food, clothing, shelter. In such conditions, many courtesans were forced to accept more dangerous or humiliating services to survive. The lack of economic independence also meant the inability to plan for the future or make long-term decisions. All resources were spent on maintaining appearance and social status necessary to attract clients. Moreover, economic instability increased psychological stress and feelings of hopelessness, as each financial failure could become the beginning of a fall into deeper poverty and helplessness. Thus, economic vulnerability and complete dependence on external factors made the life of a courtesan in ancient Rome extremely fragile and unstable. Health risks and lack of medical care. The life of a courtesan in ancient Rome was associated with serious health risks that often led to chronic illnesses and premature death. The absence of modern medicine and hygiene knowledge worsened the situation, making these women especially vulnerable. Constant physical exertion and frequent sexual contact with various partners without effective protection led to the spread of infections, including venereal diseases, which were difficult or impossible to cure at that time. Many courtesans suffered from such diseases, which weakened their physical strength and shortened their lifespan. Additionally, chronic stress and psychological trauma negatively impacted the immune system, reducing the body's resistance to diseases. Injuries caused by clients or domestic violence were also common. Medical care was either unavailable or limited to primitive methods that could not effectively treat conditions. The fear of losing clients and patrons forced women to hide their illnesses, worsening their health. Thus, health risks and lack of adequate medical support created yet another destructive aspect of a courtesan's life, making their existence even more fragile and risky. Social isolation and the inability to build a normal family. One of the most painful aspects of a courtesan's life in ancient Rome was her complete social isolation and inability to create a normal, full-fledged family. Society categorically rejected women associated with the courtesan profession, depriving them of the right to respect and recognition within their close and extended circles. Courtesans had almost no chance of marrying a respectable citizen, as their social status and reputation were so tarnished that no marriage could restore lost trust and respect. This placed them outside social norms and deprived them of the opportunity to feel like full members of society. The inability to build a family was further exacerbated by the lack of legal protection and support, making courtesans vulnerable to any injustice and violence. In a society where the family was the foundation of stability and social structure, such support simply did not exist for courtesans. Moreover, many women experienced deep feelings of loneliness and loss, as they could not provide their children with a normal childhood and safety. Their offspring were often born out of wedlock and subjected to stigmatization. Ultimately, social isolation and the inability to build a normal family became one of the hardest trials in a courtesan's life, intensifying her despair and hopelessness. Lack of prospects, and the inability to change one's fate. The life of a courtesan in ancient Rome was practically hopeless in terms of personal development and social mobility. Contrary to myths about an easy and luxurious life, most women in this profession had no real chance to leave their role and build another life. The society system was rigidly structured, and opportunities for change for courtesans were extremely limited. Lack of education, economic independence, and support made overcoming social status and changing profession impossible. Courtesans often remained forever within their role, without chances for real growth or fate alteration. Attempts to leave the profession often led to social marginalization, poverty, and complete alienation. Without connections, support, and financial resources, a woman was doomed to return to her former life or even worse circumstances. Moreover, society condemned even attempts to change, cementing the courtesan's status as permanent and unchangeable. This created an atmosphere of hopelessness and despair, depriving women of hope for a better future. Thus, the lack of prospects and inability to change one's fate turned a courtesan's life into an endless cycle of suffering and deprivation from which escape was nearly impossible. Conclusion: the tragedy of the courtesan as a symbol of oppression and loss of human dignity. The life of a courtesan in ancient Rome is not just a story about one profession, but a tragedy of millions of women trapped by the social and cultural structure of their time. Despite outward luxury, attention from influential men, and apparent freedom, behind this facade lay an irrepressible pain of losing oneself, freedom, and dignity. A courtesan was forced to sacrifice not only her body, but also her soul, constantly balancing on the edge of humiliation and survival. Her existence depended on the will and whims of others, where every day was a struggle to survive in conditions devoid of justice and protection. Society not only rejected and despised courtesans, but also deprived them of opportunities for real social integration and self-realization. Strict norms, prejudices, and laws formed a closed circle of loneliness, where every attempt to change one's fate seemed futile and doomed to fail. This fate reflects a broader problem of oppression and discrimination against women in ancient societies, where their rights and needs were ignored or suppressed. The story of the courtesan serves as a reminder of how social constructs can destroy human lives and deprive people of their most basic rights: the right to freedom, respect, and happiness. Ultimately, the tale of the courtesan is a call for understanding and empathy, for recognizing the suffering and injustices experienced by women deprived of choice and protection. It is a lesson for all times on the necessity of fighting for equality, justice, and respect for human dignity.